In 2010, the mixed martial arts promotion Ultimate Fighting Championship, better known as the UFC, achieved higher pay-per-view sales than ever before. Taking notice of the company's rapid increase in popularity and the fact that their broadcasting contract with Spike TV was soon expiring, Fox swooped in and signed a 7-year distribution agreement with the UFC that allowed them to broadcast non-pay-per-view events on all of their networks, including the subject of today's episode, Fuel TV. Prior to the Fox UFC partnership, Fuel TV was a destination for extreme sports enthusiasts. But less than 2 years after the broadcasting deal between Fox and the UFC, nearly all of the action sports content that Fuel TV built its brand upon had gone by the wayside. And not long after that, it was announced that Fuel TV would be rebranded as Fox Sports 2. But how exactly did the inclusion of UFC programming on Fuel TV cause the channel to collapse? We'll be exploring just that in today's episode of Looking Back.
Fuel TV is 24/7 action sports television. Your sports, your music, your life, all on your channel.
If you didn't have access to Fuel TV or just never tuned into it back in the day, it was truly a dream come true for anyone who was even mildly interested in extreme sports. This episode will mostly focus on the UFC's takeover of the network, but if you want a ridiculously detailed look at the history of Fuel TV, check out the video I made on it about 2 years back. I'll leave a link down below. But the abridged version of Fuel TV's story begins in the late 90s, when action sports, extreme sports, whatever you want to call them, were becoming ridiculously popular. Things really peaked in the mid-2000s, but there were video games, cartoons, movies. You could not turn on the TV without seeing something related to action sports. It was unavoidable. Like this car commercial, for example, that begged the question, do you like to skateboard? Do you want to feel that same sense of excitement while driving a vehicle? Buy a Mazda Protege. Capri Sun made you a better skater, Ritz Bits crackers were shredding half pipes, Tony was hawking bagel bites. You get my point. Corny ass commercials aside, extreme sports content was definitely being shown on TV. Competition events like the X Games and Gravity Games aired on ESPN and NBC respectively, but they were only held once or twice a year. And dedicated action sports programming had been attempted before. Like Nickelodeon had a series called Skate TV hosted by Matthew Lillard, and I honestly loved this show when I caught reruns of it, but it only lasted one season. Occasionally, a general sports program dedicated an episode to something extreme sports related. For example, MTV Sports had an episode surrounding skateboarding and rollerblading, but just one episode. You could pull up to your local shop and buy VHS tapes or subscribe to a mail order service like 411 Video Magazine, but there was definitely a hole in the market for well-produced but not overly polished action sports programming with a consistent airing schedule. In July of 2000, Fox Sports Net answered that demand with a show called Bluetorch TV, a 1-hour program that focused on action sports of all varieties. And best of all, it was set to air 5 days a week. Information on Bluetorch TV is pretty scarce, so I don't really have any viewership ratings for the show, but it was at least successful enough that when Fox began developing Fuel TV in 2002, they hired Bluetorch TV creator CJ Oliveras as Vice President of Programming and Marketing for the network. Fuel TV launched on July 1st, 2003, and you could tell right away that a lot of dedication was put into the visual styling of the network. Fuel TV launched with original shows like the surfing-centric Longboard TV, Check 1-2, a live music program with a unique twist, being that action sports athletes would occasionally jump on stage and collaborate with a musician or band, and last but not least, the longest running show in Fuel TV's 9.5 years as a channel, First Hand. First Hand was a 30-minute biography-style series that gave viewers a direct look into an entire day in the life of a specific action sports athlete. Growing up, I was pretty much exclusively into skateboarding, but this show was so well produced that I didn't care what kind of athlete the episode focused on. I was tuning in no matter what. But over the next several years, Fuel TV would introduce more original programming to their lineup, like way more. So much more that if I were to go in depth on all of their shows, this video would be like 3 hours long, and nobody has time for that. But some of my personal favorites were the aforementioned First Hand, Skate Maps, The Captain and Casey Show, The Daily Habit, Built to Shred, and last but not least, Drive with Mike Vallely. And yes, that's how you pronounce his name.
Mike Vallely. What would you have done to me if I called you Vallely?
Nothing.
Nothing?
I
I
have to sometimes reference myself as Vallely.
But unfortunately, the demand for action sports-oriented programming fell dramatically just a few years after the launch of Fuel TV. This was mostly due to the fact that during the mid-2000s, extreme sports footage was becoming way easier to access online. Entry-level camcorders and budget cameras like the Flip Mino allowed people to upload their own footage to websites like Dailymotion, Vimeo, and of course, YouTube. Now, don't get me wrong, on these platforms you typically weren't watching the same polished content that Fuel TV had to offer, but having the ability to just search for whatever action sports content you wanted and being able to watch it immediately was just so amazing at the time. Despite losing some of its audience to a wave of easily accessible internet content, Fuel TV really did remain loyal to its action sports fanbase for a very long time. They could have easily pulled a G4 by flooding their broadcast schedule with reruns of Cops and Cheaters, but they really did provide us with a steady stream of solid extreme sports content. Unfortunately, all of that changed in 2011 when, on March 1st of that year, Fuel TV announced an upcoming series hosted by Jason Ellis that ultimately kicked off a complete programming shift for the network.
It's full contact stupidity. Ellismania! Only on Fuel TV!
Fuel TV's Ellismania was set to debut on April 6, 2011, and it was described as Fight Club meets Jackass. To be honest, even though the core focus of Ellismania wasn't action sports related, this series actually did make a lot of sense within the Fuel TV lineup. The host was a recently retired pro skater turned MMA fighter. I use the term retired very loosely because he really only stopped skating on a professional level. And a lot of the fight participants came from an extreme sports background. But Ellismania truly opened the floodgates when it came to MMA and fight-related content on Fuel TV. Because on March 31st, 2011, just 1 week before Ellismania was set to premiere, Fuel TV announced a new weekly programming block called Friday Night Fight, which was set to debut just 1 day after this announcement was made. This is just a bit of speculation on my part, but it's pretty easy to see what Fuel TV, or actually their parent company Fox, was trying to do with all of these programming changes. Turning back the clock just a bit, the UFC signed a landmark deal with Spike TV in June of 2004, which granted Spike with the broadcasting rights for non-pay-per-view UFC content. And more importantly, this is where the hit reality series The Ultimate Fighter debuted.
The Ultimate Fighter. 16 guys vying for 2 contracts in the UFC, living together, training together, and fighting each other.
It's difficult to fight your friends. I'll take him down, pound his ass.
The Ultimate Fighter. Premieres Monday after Raw, only on Spike TV.
This deal was renewed several times, but as the UFC's popularity continued to climb, so did the asking price for that broadcasting contract. By January of 2011, Spike TV was paying the UFC $170 million per year for the rights to broadcast The Ultimate Fighter, along with various live events. But around that same time, the UFC reportedly proposed a new fee of $325 million per year, which Spike TV was definitely not willing to pay. At that point, the UFC considered buying a controlling stake in either Fuel TV or G4 TV in order to start a dedicated UFC network, which obviously never came to fruition, but it seems like Fox, knowing that Spike TV's contract with the UFC was coming to an end, added boxing and MMA related programming to Fuel TV's schedule to entice the brand into buying a piece of Fuel TV, or at the very least, signing some sort of deal with them. As Fuel TV continued to add more and more fight content into their programming lineup, CJ Oliveras, a pivotal figure to not only Fuel TV, but extreme sports programming in general, stepped down from his position as both general manager and executive vice president on April 26, 2011. CJ shifted to a consulting role for action sports programming at Fuel TV, and his positions were filled just 2 days later by George Greenberg. And I'm not sure if all of the previously mentioned programming and executive level changes had anything to do with it, but on August 18, 2011, Fuel TV's parent company Fox announced a massive deal with the UFC.
Hello and welcome to Studio 2A at the Fox Network Center. I'm Joe Rogan and I'm very excited that you're able to join us today for this historic moment for Fox Sports and the UFC.
This deal between Fox and the UFC was set to begin on January 1st, 2012, and was good for a total of 7 years. UFC content can now be shown on the flagship Fox channel, the FX network, and of course, Fuel TV. By the way, this press conference Fox held to announce this deal was just a complete mess. It was a live event, I get it, mistakes happen, but Joe Rogan was presenting and he was just stuttering and sweating bullets.
To kick things off, I'd like to introduce the distinguished executives.
This dude was in the middle of a heated Angry Birds session and couldn't be bothered to put his cell phone down. Transition music was accidentally played in the middle of the presentation.
Former UFC champion Rashad Evans.
But most importantly, Joe Rogan mixed up the names of George St. Pierre and Frankie Edgar, and things just got so awkward.
Frankie Edgar and UFC welterweight champion George St. Pierre.
Ooh. Left that one off. Switch seats.
Anyway, during the initial reports of this contract between Fox and the UFC, it was said that Fuel TV would only broadcast preliminary fights. But towards the later part of 2011, both George Greenberg and UFC president Dana White confirmed that Fuel TV would become the ultimate destination for UFC programming starting on the first day of 2012. But Fox didn't wait until the new year to start shaking things up at Fuel TV. On November 2nd, 2011, the network's first UFC-related show debuted, Punk Payback with Bas Rutten. And right before the new year, one of Fuel TV's longest-running, most popular shows, The Daily Habit, was canceled after 8 years on the air. By this point, anyone who was still tuning into Fuel TV for their action sports fix probably saw that the writing was on the wall. If not, Fox made their plans for the network crystal clear on January 1st, 2012, with the launch of UFC on Fuel TV.
January 1st. It's time! Fuel TV and the UFC are teaming up, and something big's going down. The wait is finally over! Bringing you more UFC coverage than any other network. And it all starts with an unprecedented 24 hours of UFC.
On New Year's Day in 2012, Fuel TV committed to their promise of becoming the cable home for the UFC, with a 24-hour UFC marathon. That same day, Fuel TV unveiled a completely new branding style. They abandoned the sharp-edged logo that they had been using for nearly a decade in favor of something a bit tougher looking that signified a new direction for the channel. Fuel TV's 24-hour UFC marathon was a huge success, producing the second most watched day in Fuel TV history. The network's first live UFC event was scheduled for February 15th, and average viewership continued to thrive in the weeks leading up to it, averaging at about 217,000 viewers with a peak viewer count of 315,000. UFC on Fuel TV 1 set 2 records for the channel, an all-time ratings record and the #1 most watched day in network history, the latter of which was broken once again by UFC on Fuel TV 2. Jumping back to December 2011, Fuel TV's new general manager George Greenberg made a bold promise. He stated, "To have 25% of our programming devoted to the UFC, we can now cherry pick the premier action sports stuff. You're gonna see live surfing that you haven't seen before in this network, key snowboarding events, but we'll just be more selective with the addition of UFC." It's clear that their plans shifted pretty much immediately after seeing how many viewers were being drawn to Fuel TV because of the UFC. Going into the year 2013, pretty much all action sports content had been replaced by UFC programming. Around that same time, it was reported that another Fox-owned channel, the racing-centric Speed Network, was set to rebrand as Fox Sports 1, and it was rumored that Fuel TV would be renamed Fox Sports 2 alongside it. Fox was looking to broaden the focus of their niche sports channels in order to compete with the massive footprint that ESPN had with their networks. Fox Sports 1 would be a direct competitor to ESPN, Fox Sports 2 would go up against ESPN 2, meanwhile ESPN 8 The Ocho would remain uncontested.
International dodgeball open here on ESPN 8 The Ocho. If it's almost a sport, we've got it here.
Fox waited to officially announce their plan to rebrand Fuel TV until August 11th, 2013, just 6 days before the network changed over to Fox Sports 2. After rebranding, pretty much all of the UFC programming that drew audiences to Fuel TV in the first place was slowly moved over to Fox Sports 1. And Fox Sports 2 would be used for mostly preliminary fights, which is kind of ironic because that was the original plan that Fox had for Fuel before they decided to turn it into essentially the UFC channel. It might be sort of a bold accusation to say that the UFC killed Fuel TV because the network was really struggling during the later stages of its life. The UFC actually kind of acted as a shot of adrenaline that kept it going for another 2 years. But seeing Fuel TV slowly abandon its extreme sports origins and then receive a relaunch as Fox Sports 2 just felt like a swift kick to the groin. As much as I missed the golden age of Fuel TV in the mid-2000s, I understand that at the end of the day, they're not just a provider of entertainment, they're also a business. Simply put, action sports content was not attracting enough of an audience, and the channel was just not sustainable without some sort of change. But there is a bit of a happy ending to this story. In 2016, CJ Olivares, the same guy who was forced to step down as general manager and executive vice president of Fuel TV just a few years earlier, negotiated a buyout from Fox of not just the Fuel TV brand, but all of the network's assets. Fuel TV now operates as an independent streaming service, and most of the shows from the early days of the network are still watchable. Of course, a streaming app will never be able to capture the charm that the network had during its golden years, but at least I can still pull up and watch old episodes of The Captain and Casey Show. And that's it for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Please leave a comment down below with your thoughts and opinions. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.